The United Nations is warning Russia's invasion of Ukraine could lead to a, quote, hurricane of hunger and a meltdown of the global food system. Wheat and fertilizer prices have soared since the war began 3 weeks ago. The UN's Food and Agricultural Organization warns global food prices could jump by 22% this year, which will have a devastating impact on the global south.
The war in Ukraine intensified the record high food and energy prices and triggered global crisis that will drive millions more into extreme poverty, magnifying hunger and malnutrition. Food and energy crises are particularly devastating for the poorest and most vulnerable people.
The war in Ukraine added $50 to the monthly budget of a family in Dhaka. In Lahore, it meant choosing between fertilizer and school fees. This is the real cost of a fight between empires. In this episode, we ask, is Russia the imperial threat, or is NATO the empire we're not allowed to name? Let's unpack it. What does imperial threat even mean in 2025? When Western media says Russia is an imperial threat, they usually point to one thing. Moscow is trying to control its neighbors by force. They highlight Chechnya, Georgia, Crimea, and now the full-scale war in Ukraine, a pattern of land grabs, puppet regimes, and smashed cities. Think tanks like RAND literally argue that Russia's imperial ambitions are a clear threat to NATO. But pause. What is an imperial threat? It's not just one country being aggressive. Empire means the power to shape other nations' choices through troops, bases, sanctions, debt, propaganda, or trade rules, without ever asking their people. By that definition, we have to look at beyond Russia. Because if we only see one empire, that's already propaganda. Let's examine Russia's empire, from czars to Putin. First, let's be honest about Russia. Russia was an empire long before NATO existed. Under the czars, Moscow expanded across Siberia, the Caucasus, Central Asia, Poland, Finland, and beyond, often erasing languages and crushing local elites. Historians call it internal colonization, that is, empire built by swallowing neighbors on land instead of sailing across oceans like Britain or France. Inside this empire, serfdom and even forms of slavery existed into the 19th century. Peasants tied to landowners, bought and sold with estates. Then came the Soviet Union, the USSR. On one hand, the USSR crushed Nazi Germany at a human cost no Western country can even imagine, an estimated 27 million dead, with decisive battles at Stalingrad, Kursk, and finally Berlin. On the other hand, the same Soviet state dominated Eastern Europe, installing communist regimes in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and others. It rolled tanks into Budapest in 1956 and Prague in 1968, whenever people tried to break free. So yes, there is a Russian imperial tradition, liberator in one region, occupier in another. Fast forward to the post-Soviet era, Chechnya, two brutal wars in the 1990s and early 2000s to crush separatism. Georgia 2008. Russian troops intervene and two regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, end up under Russian control. Crimea 2014. Russia annexes the peninsula after a disputed referendum condemned by the UN General Assembly. Ukraine 2022. A war against Ukraine, mass civilian casualties, and open attempts to redraw borders by force. If any other power did this, most people would have no problem calling it imperial behavior. So yes, Russia is acting like an empire in its neighborhood. But here's where the story gets uncomfortable for NATO. Because Russia is not the only empire in the room. Let's look into NATO's empire, bases, bombs, and rules. NATO was founded in 1949 as a defensive alliance. That's the official line. Article 5 says, an attack on one is an attack on all. But after the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, something strange happened. The enemy disappeared, and the alliance expanded. From 16 members during the Cold War to 32 today, moving steadily east, Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic in 1999, then the Baltic states, Bulgaria, Romania, and more in 2004, later Montenegro, North Macedonia, most recently Finland and Sweden after the 2022 Russian war on Ukraine. Every step was presented as countries freely choosing security, From Moscow's window it looked like this: NATO tanks and missiles creeping closer and closer to Russian borders. At the same time, NATO moved from defense to expeditionary wars. Yugoslavia 1999, bombing campaign over Kosovo without UN Security Council approval. In Afghanistan, NATO took over the ISAF mission after the 2001 US invasion. In Libya 2011, NATO's no-fly zone turned into regime change. The state collapsed, leaving weapons and militants flooding across Africa. Add to this, the U.S, NATO's core, maintains military bases in 70-plus countries, controls global surveillance systems, and has the ability to sanction or freeze the reserves of entire nations. That is imperial capacity on a scale Russia simply does not have. So when Western leaders talk about Russian imperialism, while quietly forgetting Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, or drone wars stretching from Pakistan to Yemen, people in the global south notice the double standard. You don't have to love the Kremlin to see that NATO is not a neutral referee. Now let's focus on the security dilemma. Everyone claims to be defensive. Here's the trap the world is stuck in: the security dilemma. Every side says, we're only acting defensively. The other side is the aggressor. NATO's story goes like this. After decades of Soviet domination, Eastern European countries exercised their sovereign right to join the alliance. Expansion was never aimed at threatening Russia, but at protecting new democracies from a neighbor with a proven history of military intervention. Ukraine, like any sovereign state, has the right to choose its own alliances. Arming Kyiv is about upholding international law and the right to self-defense. Russia's story is built on a different memory. While not a formal treaty, declassified U.S. diplomatic memos from 1990 to 91 record Western leaders like U.S. Secretary of State James Baker suggesting to Soviet President Gorbachev that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward after German reunification. From Moscow's perspective, the subsequent expansion to Poland, the Baltics, and now talk of Ukraine felt like a strategic betrayal and encirclement. Missile systems in Poland and Romania are framed not as defensive shields, but as offensive threats minutes from Russian cities. So, from NATO's view, Russia's invasion is unprovoked aggression. From Moscow's view, the war is a tragic but forced preemptive defense against NATO's creep. This is how empires talk. Both claim innocence. Both claim they are reacting, never initiating. And in the middle of that argument, Ukraine is bleeding. Now let's bring this down to where many of you are watching from: India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and across the wider global south. For you, this war is not just a map on TV. It's about LPG cylinder prices in Mumbai, diesel costs for farmers in Punjab, and wheat flour becoming a luxury in Dhaka. The data is stark. In Bangladesh, a 2023 study by the South Asian Network on Economic Modeling, SANEM, found that fertilizer prices jumped by over 100% after the war began, directly contributing to a rise in school dropouts and child marriage rates as families scrambled to survive. Sugar prices rose by nearly 60%, squeezing household budgets to the breaking point. In Pakistan, the state bank reported inflation hitting a 48-year high in 2023, with energy imports becoming a crushing burden. In India, the government leveraged historic ties to secure discounted Russian oil, a pragmatic move that spared consumers even sharper price shocks, but illustrated the tightrope walk of strategic autonomy in a divided world. From this vantage point, the question, is Russia an imperial threat or is NATO, sounds different. India refused to join Western sanctions, kept buying discounted Russian oil, and repeatedly abstained at the UN, officially pushing dialogue and diplomacy, but also defending its own strategic autonomy. Pakistan and others have tried to balance between Western financial dependence and energy deals, while coping with inflation and IMF pressure. From this vantage point, the question, is Russia an imperial threat or is NATO, sounds different. Russia looks dangerous to its neighbors, yes, but also like a longtime partner in arms, energy, and sometimes political backing. The US and NATO look like the same powers that invaded Iraq, bombed Afghanistan, and backed coups from Latin America to the Middle East. Many in the global south don't see good versus evil. They see two rival empires fighting over who gets to define the world order, while the rest of us pay for it in higher prices, debt, and instability. So, is Russia the liberator or Russia the oppressor? To really answer the question, we have to hold two truths together. Truth number one, Russia helped save Europe from Hitler. The Red Army broke the back of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, liberated Auschwitz, and took Berlin. Without Soviet blood and sacrifice, there would be no liberated Europe to talk about. Truth number two, Russia, whether Tsarist, Soviet, or post-Soviet, has often acted as an empire. Ask Chechens, Georgians, Ukrainians, or dissidents in Eastern Europe. Ask people whose languages were suppressed and whose borders were redrawn from Moscow. Western narratives often erase the first truth. Russian narratives often erase the second. What do we at Liberation Lens say? We refuse to erase either. Because honest history is the enemy of propaganda, whether it flies a NATO flag or a Russian one. How about NATO the protector, NATO the empire? The same double vision applies to NATO. Ask people in Poland or the Baltics and they will tell you, NATO is our shield. Without it, we could be the next Ukraine. Given their history under Soviet domination, those fears are not imaginary. But ask people in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, or Serbia, and NATO looks less like a shield, more like a flying empire, dropping bombs in the name of humanitarian intervention or the war on terror, then leaving chaos behind. Ask families in South Asia whose sons fought and died in NATO's war in Afghanistan, or whose economies now wobble because of a European war they never chose. Again, two truths. NATO does deter Russian tanks in some countries. NATO has also exported war and regime change far beyond its treaty area. If we only see one truth, we are already inside somebody's propaganda. So, who is the real imperial threat? Here's the uncomfortable answer. Russia is seemingly an imperial threat in its region. Its war on Ukraine seems illegal, brutal, and imperial, whatever excuses Moscow uses. NATO is an imperial system on a global scale. It acts as the military wing of a US-led order that claims universality but routinely violates other nations' sovereignty when it suits its interests. If you live in Eastern Europe, Russia feels like the bigger danger. If you live in Iraq, Libya, or Afghanistan, NATO and the US are the ones who destroyed your country. If you live in South Asia, you are watching both empires play chess with your fuel prices, your wheat, your currency, and your future. The truth is, ordinary people have no empire. They have only their memory, history, and their ability to say, "No, I will not repeat your script. I will write my own." What does this really mean for us at Liberation Lens? So what do we do with all this? First, we stop letting anyone sell us a Marvel movie version of geopolitics, heroes in blue, villains in red. The Soviet Union was both liberator and oppressor. The West is both builder of institutions and destroyer of nations. Russia today is both challenger of US hegemony and invader of a neighbor. Second, we ask a different question. Which system, Russian, American, or European, actually respects the sovereignty, dignity, and development of the global South? Look closely at the record. Who controls the IMF, the World Bank, and SWIFT? Who imposes sanctions that starve populations? Who turns your country into a battleground for great power competition? Not just Russia, not just NATO, but a whole architecture of power that treats your life as collateral damage. Third, we remember our own history. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the subcontinent knows what empire looks like. You have seen railways built for extraction, borders drawn in London, famines worsened by colonial policy. So when today's powers speak the language of freedom, democracy, and security, Liberation Lens asks, security for whom? Democracy for whom? Freedom to do what and for whose corporations? Then, our final word is Russia an imperial threat or is NATO? Here's our answer, both are empires. They just brand themselves differently. Russia says protecting Russians and fighting Nazism. NATO says defending democracy and preserving the rules-based order. But if you strip away the slogans, Both are willing to sacrifice other people's lives, land, and futures to secure their own power. The real struggle of our time is not Russia versus the West. It is empires versus peoples. People in Ukraine who want to live without occupation. People in Russia who don't want to die in someone else's war. People in Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan still living among ruins. People in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh paying double for fertilizer, cooking oil, and petrol because distant empires chose conflict over compromise. Liberation begins when the people of the post-colonial world refuse to be spectators in a new colonial game and start being witnesses. Witnesses who remember who really paid the price for Hitler's defeat. Who see both Russian tanks and NATO jets for what they are. Who know that lives in the global south are worth more than any great power game. If this resonates with you, don't just scroll. Share it with someone in Delhi, Karachi, or Dhaka who's tired of paying for someone else's war. Talk about it. Break the script. Because as long as empires write the story, we will always be cast as extras in someone else's war. This is Liberation Lens, and perspective has never mattered more.